Good day to our viewers on EBNet Stream. In today's executive meet and greet, I'm joined by Delphine Govender, the founder and chief investment officer of Perpetua Investment Managers. This is Leon Kraling. Delphine, welcome.
Hi, Leon. Such a pleasure to be here and to be with your viewers as well.
Thank you for taking the time. Delphine, I've known of you in the market through my 30-year career, but never have I really dug in and tried to understand the path that you've taken over your years. And when I looked at your profile on LinkedIn, the one word that stuck out to me was focus. And the reason I say that is that I almost get the perception from looking at your career progression that you've had a very clear path in mind. I don't know if that is true or not. Maybe just explain to our viewers how you went from university to ultimately entering this investment world, to becoming an entrepreneur and starting up a business and ultimately succeeding. Or have you succeeded? I'll be interested in that.
Yeah, in this industry, I guess only time tells. But yeah, that's a fantastic observation, Leon. And you're right. I mean, and I guess with the benefit of hindsight, there has absolutely been intentionality in the process of my decision making, although it always hasn't been a straight line, but also in the outcome of where I find myself here, all these kind of years later. From university, so interestingly, I was quite clear from school that I actually wanted to become a chartered accountant. Interestingly, my parents are both, well, my dad has passed on, but my parents are both lecturers, and one in academics, my dad in science, and my mom in English and education. So I decided to go for a blend of the two, which at the time was like a career in the world of perhaps business. The CIO route I chose because I felt that it was going to give me, and this is really, if you think about it, the early 90s, the best base in terms of what I could go further into. Fast forward through university, I realized as much as, accounting was very much the language of finance and I understood it, auditing not necessarily was the thing that I was developing a love for, but realized that you have to do the 3 years of articles to get the qualification. But I was very fortunate in my first year of articles when I was in the Durban office of Deloitte, the accounting firm, that I was selected to go on a 2-month exchange program to Merrill Lynch's offices in the World Financial Center in New York as a 22-year-old. In fact, I turned 22 while I was there. Got exposed for 2 months, basically, to the world of investing directly. Returned back home and promptly told my parents, as a first-year article clerk, that I had discovered the part of the world of finance and numbers that I was going to focus on. It was going to be investing, and I was going to do everything in my power to get as directly close to it as possible. And in fact, at that end of my first year of articles, I transferred articles from the Durban practice office of Deloitte to Cape Town. And was very fortunate, in a way, lucky, that the only space to allocate me was to the financial cluster in auditing, and almost all my clients were asset managers. Interestingly, back then in 1996, this little, I say in inverted commas, asset manager called Coronation Fund Managers was one of my clients. And so, Leon, over those years, I was determined that even though, the auditing profession was not where I was going to stay, I was going to make the best of my years, but go straight into investments. And through those 2 remaining years of articles, whoever was willing to listen, I would say I want to join investments. And so when I finished my articles, I had 3 job offers to become an analyst, and I decided to take the one at Old Mutual Asset Managers. So I finished articles on a Friday in 98, and I joined Old Mutual Asset Managers as an equity analyst the following Monday. And while the path
sorry, just to interrupt there, you pretty much at the same time started a CFA immediately and completed that in no time as well.
Correct. And interestingly, it was not as common as it is now to do CFA during university. Now I know it's a bit more competitive, so a lot more university students are starting them. We typically did it once you started as an analyst. And so I started in, doing my CFA, I think it was 98, 99, when I started out in the investments world. And it sort of makes sense. And I still give that as advice to people, that you're often best starting your CFA soon after you've finished studying as possible, because it's just first year is close to university. And then, but actually 3rd year CFA is so much closer to the actual work of being in investment. So you actually have a much higher chance of succeeding. So I think I finally finished CFA or qualified, with it all in 2001.
So, I mean, I remember back in those days, it was all CFA, CFA, CFA. Do you still hold it in the same esteem? Do you still think it's I don't know if critical is the right word, but a good qualification for anybody that aspires to an investment management career?
I think so, Leon. And I know that there are many routes. The interesting thing about the investment industry is that there's no single qualification that gets you in. You could be, and if you look globally, it's actually much more diverse in the sense that you've got politics graduates that come into investments, history graduates, English lit. We have less of that in South Africa. In South Africa, it's much more the numerate fields of, accounting, the CIO route, business science, actuarial science, engineering. But what CFA does, it almost kind of ties a ribbon around that, almost the normalizing of the sort of knowledge gap that anyone that has any ability to understand what the investments journey is about. I think the CFA just creates this equalizer. And so particularly where you've come from a diverse undergraduate or graduate background, I still hold the CFA as almost the global industry gold standard to making sure that when we use terminology, when we speak about things, we're kind of at the same bar internally. Yeah. Particularly, I'd say, if you're in your 20s, if you're starting out in the industry.
Okay. So you were an analyst and you pretty quickly moved over to Allan Gray. So how did that happen? And if you can maybe explain your progression within Allan Gray. You spent a long time there. So I just want to understand that progression and ultimately that the 13 years or so that it was, or 10 years that you spent there.
Yeah. So I joined Allan Gray when I was around in 2001, and I was around 27 at the time. Interestingly, I was born in the same year that Allan Gray started. So I've always kind of tracked my growth and the firm's age at the time. And Allan Gray, in July of 2001 that I joined, was probably less than 60 staff, and also the assets that month were around 15 billion, 15. So it was a completely different firm to the firm that most.
What year was that?
2001.
2001.
July 2000.
All right,
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
It was a very interesting time to have joined the firm. It had just come off what had been very difficult performance, track record, or patch in the late 90s. And then that all turned as the tech bubble burst. And then Allan Gray printed extremely good outperformance once the tech bubble burst and all the tech stocks declined and the value stocks rose. And I joined as an analyst. In fact, the current CIO of Allan Gray, Duncan, joined a few months before me. Also as a trainee analyst, all of us on contract, the current chair, Ian Little, had joined a few months prior to that. So that whole cohort, we were in the 2001 cohort. The very respected and unfortunately late Simon Marais was a senior portfolio manager. He hired me actually at Allan Gray when he was CIO, but Stephen Moldenhall was the CIO that we worked under. It was a fantastic opportunity to be in a firm that was relatively small in terms of assets, but was building quite off benchmark active portfolios, because that was what was possible when you were a smaller firm and you had a focus on really looking for mispricings, neglected ideas, and also you were really about a pure alpha generation pursuit. And quite fortunately for our cohort of the 2001, the assets of Allan Gray were starting to grow quite exponentially. From 2001 to 2005, the firm went up, several X, almost became quite unrecognizable in terms of how fast assets grew. And that was very aligned to how performance was delivered. And so if you remember back in those early days, Leon, 2000, it was really the boutiques at the time were Allan Gray, Coronation, Investec, RMB, the firms that are, today, or those that still exist, today's mega managers. And they really took share from the first firm I worked at, which was All Mutual Asset Managers, the life company asset managers, Sanlam, etc. And so we saw a real pivot in the 2000s from asset management 1.0, which is what I call it, which is life company, to professional asset managers being, what is now known as, the professional mega managers of the investment brands that I've just mentioned, of Allan Gray, Coronation, 91, etc. So it was a fantastic decade to be there. In terms of my career projection, was fortunate to be given the opportunity alongside my colleagues of the day to be understudies as portfolio managers quite early on. So from about 2004, we were almost assistant portfolio managers. And then in 2005, I was appointed a portfolio manager. And then in 2006, also a director to the company. And again, all of those points are quite important because we were part of a business at a time that was really growing extremely fast. And we also got to see all elements of what contributed to growth. And I think if I didn't have that exposure, including the benefit of business decision making, the understanding of the full spectrum of a fund manager firm, from front office to middle office to back office, even though our core job was in investments, having had the absolute privilege of spending time with somebody like Alan and Mr. Gray, I don't think I would have had the same almost fortitude and belief in starting my own firm, because I wasn't just having had the view of just a single portfolio manager with a narrow lens in a firm. It was a very unique time to have been in that business where, the firm I joined was 15 billion. The firm I left was about 480 billion back in 2012. And so all of that really led me to being, feeling confident that I could do it. And then the other critical part of it was seeing the opportunity for the next generation. So I would say Perpetua is a player in asset management 3.0 in this current generation. And so this is what's been interesting to see how it is possible in a challenged industry to gain share against very formidable competitors now.
Just to go back one step, I view the Alan Gray, I'm going to call it the school. Sorry, it's not the right term, but I hold that in high regard because I've seen many people come through that, and it's a tough school ultimately to make your way through, but it teaches certain disciplines, I think, as well, which are critical in the investment management world. I often share with people that Alan Gray, as they see it today, they don't realize what Alan Gray went through in the late 90s off the back of their, call it, dogged sort of determination to stick to their investment philosophy, which thankfully they did. But I'll never forget Dr. Simon Moret coming to defend appointment on certain cases where he would literally walk in there with the trustees' decision made, you're fired. And he would somehow, without fancy slides or anything that was in any way competitive with some of the up-and-coming guys, he would put up slides that were printed straight off iNet, those old blue screen iNets, and he would just talk, and he would talk with passion about it. And 9 times out of 10, he managed to retain the business. But the business institutionally it got down to, I think it was around about 4 billion or so in size during that period. So I take my hat off to that, and that taught me a lot around how to assess asset managers and so on as well. The question is, as these second generation managers have come about, they've gotten bigger. Their performance of some of them continues to be strong, but not to the degrees that people bought them for ultimately. So now you have generation 3, and you mentioned yourself in that light. But that seems to be taking time. Now, maybe I'm just a bit impatient, waiting for the new guys to come through. But how do you view that? How do you view the growth in assets, maintaining performance through growth in assets, but also this new generation of managers coming through, the Perpetuas, the Fairtrees, the Truffles, and so on, and the pace thereof? And in that context, and sorry, I'll stop talking now, but in that context, you launched a business, and launching a business is tough. And every time, I've launched a business in Europe, private markets business, there's not a single projection that we've met. Everything takes longer. That's just the reality. So how have you managed that process?
Such fascinating observations, Leon, and in fact, all completely spot on. And each one of those is probably a little mini interview on its own. But very briefly, I'd say the first thing is that cohort of, what was it that contributed to the success of, if we were to call it asset management 2.0, which is the current absolutely formidable investment brands, as I would call them, being Alan Gray, Coronation, 91, and a few others that M&G is slowly coming up as a competitor in relative to them in that generation. And it was really their ability to deliver differentiated performance versus the incumbents of the day, which were the life companies. And have done so incredibly well, and have also done so across distribution channels. So not just in what was the traditional institutional pension fund market retirement, but also across the retail market, launching funds. And so when you come to asset management 3.0, and your observation is absolutely valid, which is how come this generation hasn't grown at the same pace as, say, 2.0 was able to. Firstly, I would say number one is that the actual overall industry hasn't grown to the same extent. So we actually have been in a culture of dis-savings, and given the employment, just the economics of South Africa, it's a much more challenging period. So if you think of the period of 2000 and just the shifts that we had in growth in the economy from 2000 to 2005, we had the savings industry growing, we had household debt to disposable income growing. So you had a lot more growth in the underlying economy, which fueled employment, it fueled savings, and it fueled the investment industry. So it almost made it easier for the current large investment brands to win share from the insurance brands, investment brands in that environment. We haven't had that. We have not had a growing economy. And also our competition is now much more formidable. So it was almost, if you built a differentiated portfolio like you were capable of doing in 2000, you were able to win quite easily the share from just delivering differentiated returns. Nowadays, if you think of the last 10 years, even though you've mentioned some great players that are asset management 3.0, it's much harder to differentiate and deliver differentiated portfolios when your incumbent competition is significantly better than perhaps what existed in the late 90s. And it's just a function of facts because of the depth of investment teams, the availability of information, of systems, of tools that are available now that can support investment outcomes that was not available before. And then the last point I'd make is the intermediation of our market. So the one point to make, you mentioned that, Alan Gray in the early years had the opportunity with, Dr. Simon Ray to stand in front of clients and almost have the opportunity to change the minds of trustees in the room. That is far less available as it stands today. So the current, boutique generation, or for want of a better word, is far more intermediated. So most of our engagements are through, the consulting route or the multi-manager route, which is totally understandable, but it does mean that unless capacity is growing in the consultant or the intermediated layer, it is very hard for that layer to keep on top of every single new boutique that is coming through, because it's a function of life cycle. We're at a stage in the life cycle of the investment industry in South Africa where by nature, in people that were in these large firms 20 years ago, for that 1 in every 5 that wants to try their hand at building their own firm, whether it's something that is a firm or just a 3-person team to manage family and friends' money, it's just much harder to displace the competition relative to how it was 20 years ago. So there's many factors. And the last point I'd just add is that those ingredients for success of this generation of firms, I'd say, is a much longer list of requirements compared to what you needed to do in 2000. It's almost like from 2000 and 2005, you really just had to show alpha, and that was going to be enough. Because even if you were a 15 billion rand firm, like Alan Gray was, when you showed alpha and withstanding cycles, you were able to win quite significant amounts of assets in a very short period of time. I'd say the current cohort, we've got to do much more than just prove outperformance. We've got to prove what it means that we're building a sustainable firm, depth in the team, the culture of excellence that has to be assessed. So that whole credibility is a far higher bar that we have to meet, which is more challenging when you have less chance to get in front of client decision makers than perhaps was available 20 years ago.
It's interesting that you say that. I think, first of all, this the power of the gatekeeper or the intermediary with the advent of multi-manager obviously was, I'm not going to say that was the start of it, but then COVID, I think, added to that in terms of how clients ultimately get serviced. But now, and it's been going for years, is the thrust to umbrella funds, which I can understand the reasons therefore. But I was actually asking the question, and we're holding a webinar this Wednesday on the future of umbrella funds, where we've got a bit of a debate going. It will be already have done by the time this is published. But the question we're asking is, we can see the benefits of it, but what are the unintended consequences? And from a competitive investment management landscape, I keep asking that question, is that as more and more standalone funds convert, investment management starts becoming this narrow wholesale place, but then focus on retail.
Yeah,
essentially is where the world's going.
Yeah, and I mean, that's an absolute reality. And I think what is occurring is that capacity to generate outperformance relative to whatever benchmark you're being compared to that alpha part is being significantly whittled away, just even through scale. And so there's quite a high price actually being paid for beta at the moment in the South African market, largely because it's coming in the form of a very safe pair of hands. And so I would almost say that the career risk almost sort of notion that we've always spoken about in our industry, which is you tend to place assets, because it's a credibility game, with the trusted brand or the trusted name because it's better known, even though you're sacrificing return. I'm wondering how long that's going to continue, for example, as passive starts to grow, which is giving you much cheaper beta than almost expensive beta that is called, alpha. And so I think it's really about saying, how do you combine the different fund managers that are at different points in their life stage to actually optimize the return? So that old core satellite approach, how do you optimize returns? It doesn't have to be just one or the other. All the current large firms were small ones. And in fact, my view is that I don't think we need to repeat this generation by building another 5 500 billion rand firms. We don't need to do that. What would serve clients well, because ultimately that's what we're trying to do. What would optimize risk-adjusted returns would be to have a combination of what I call scaled boutiques, firms that are big enough that can withstand the business risk of underperformance, like you spoke about, the Alan Gray of the late 90s, but then small enough that across strategies that they can extract differentiated returns and alpha, which is not available, unfortunately, in a concentrated, market like South Africa, when you have all your assets in just a few hands. And so I'm hopeful about that.
Still 50% of the market, at least institutionally, is probably sitting in multi-asset or balance type mandates. So it's also interesting to see where that evolves to. But anyway, you now have your own business that you founded. You've made a success of it. I don't know if you would call it yet a success in the context of your vision for it. Just share with me, this is your Oprah moment. Share with me the good and the bads, the stresses and the strains that perhaps you face, because it's not you're not immune. Everyone goes through similar things. So maybe just give a bit of insight in terms of that journey.
Yeah, I mean, true, it's an Oprah moment, and you should write a book. And the reality is that I think, firstly, any person that sets out as an entrepreneur, there's multiple combinations. So there's kind of the extrinsics, which is what is the opportunity set, and we've discussed that. Why do you have a right to win, as an example, to use that terminology in the market? But then there's also the intrinsic motivation. What is it that you believe that you could bring in a package of a firm with a purpose and a mission and a vision and values that is something that has a chance to resonate and last and make a difference? And I think one of the areas that we did was, that we firmly believe in is not just having a firm that is absolutely going to compound clients' money, because this is ultimately what our endeavor is about, but also to understand our responsibility as a role player in the investment value chain, which is really about contributing in almost a societal way in terms of the impact we make. So whether that's internally as a business, whether that's externally. And so those, every morning you wake up and you're right. I think the hardest thing in a knowledge-based industry where the reason why you are trusted is sometimes more intangible than tangible, because it's not as though the best performing managers are the ones that have all the assets today. Because if that was just the pure objective reality, then the assets, allocation in the industry would look quite different. So you really have to wake up every day and remind yourself of that kind of purpose-driven intrinsic motivation, because that journey and that of how you grow and your measure of success. And this is the interesting thing, because we've decided in the investment industry that assets under management is an important measure of success. Number of awards you win is an important measure of success. Long-term track record, absolutely an important measure of success. But there's no single measure that says this is the best investment firm, because it is this probabilistic profession. And there's almost much in the eye of the beholder that is not just factual or evidence-based. And so the frustration, you would correctly point out, is that you tend to find that whatever is in the eye of the beholder, whatever constraints, whatever perceptions, whatever fears, whatever needs, tends to drive the decision for who gets supported. And therefore, this ends up being a game of patience. I had never had a single kind of belief or delusion that, you can open up a business that's an investment firm that's all about earning trust and then just hope, the money will just flow in. And in fact, I'd say one of the best gifts we have received as a firm was to have had a slow, steady growth as a firm. That's been a harder time when our style of investing was out of favor, which is very much all-encompassing value, not a deep value, so an all-encompassing approach. But now that we've kind of got an outstanding foundation, your ability to now inflect off this base is much higher. And I feel it's a much more sustainable opportunity. But you're 100% right. It does not come in a straight line, the success. The challenges of managing, human resource in a human capital industry are also more complex in terms of the generational issues, in terms of the influence of technology, in terms of the outlook, in terms of client sphere, in terms of the volatility. 20 years ago, Leon, you and I would never have spoken, for example, about geopolitics, in a meeting, and now it dominates meetings. So the shifts and the increasing threats and vulnerabilities. But the one thing I think that I feel very almost assured about is that if you're in the endeavor and the vocation, which is the one that I decided when I was 22 was the one that was meant for me, very much understanding that it's a privilege to take care of clients' hard-earned assets. There's almost nothing that you can't overcome on any given day that is an internal point. And the market is perhaps, you mentioned it almost in a way when you spoke about how we have to respond, is one of the most humbling almost spaces that one can function in as a profession.
But it's you speak about patience, and I almost expected that, because that is the clear answer in terms of it. I don't think people always realize what that truly means, because it's not just an emotional thing. It's not like, okay, just sit down and relax kind of thing. At the end of the day, it's about working capital. It's about paying the people that you need. It's about having sufficient intellectual capital so you can produce what the clients expect to build the track record. It's a very difficult patience is difficult in investment management, both from a philosophy perspective, but also from a business development perspective. So that's always a major challenge, and I take my hat off to you for managing to ride through the waves over time. But anyway, imagine that I was a 20-something-year-old, which I'm definitely not anymore. What's your advice to me in terms of my career from your experiences? What's the thing that's held you in good stead all the way through? We've spoken about focus. You've now spoken about patience. Anything else, or is that it?
So my sense is that, and one of the things, and I do speak to a lot of young people, students, etc., and there's an interesting kind of mindset that goes on at the moment about this focus on passion. And that if, this is my passion and I need to pursue my passion. And in truth, Leon, as much as I was so interested in my early years in investments, none of us that have kind of had the longevity and the resilience and that ability to stay in the game, did it because at 20 we said we were passionate about investing. It's almost as though, where was it that our natural skill set, our mindsets, our emotional capacity, our left brain and our right brain, and then the space that we wanted to apply our hard work and talent into, where was it that we were finding the most amount of resonance, comfort, feedback loop, discomfort that we were willing to take on, that then developed into a passion? And so I would just, for young people that are 20 right now, to you, the 20-year-old you or me, I would just say, focus much more on the areas that naturally sit comfortably with you, that you naturally resonate with, that you want to develop a curiosity about finding out on your own, intrinsically, more and more and more, without ever feeling as though I have to tell myself every morning, this is my passion and therefore I need to do it. That almost sets you up for a very tricky outcome, because it's almost as though you have to feel that energy. But in fact, the energy and the feel you get is because of where you find a natural connection to, that you become strong at, that it never really feels like every day is a job. Mm-hmm. It's all an intellectual endeavor. And that really develops into a passion, which means that you or I will never want to retire.
So the one thing I've always been notoriously bad on, which people say to me, is work-life balance. And I keep on saying to them, work-life balance is about loving your work, not about having other things to offset the time you spend at work kind of thing. And so I agree with you completely. It's about Where do you feel that energy? Where are you putting that energy in? Where's it driving you towards that? When you wake up, you want to do it. You're excited to do it. You're looking forward to seeing the outcomes, and you can't presuppose that. You can't invent that. It's a natural thing within each of us. Anyway, Delphine, thank you very much. I have one final question for you. It's a little bit off the wall. Who does your office decorations or decorating? Because your offices are magnificent, I must say. One of the best I've seen, if not the best.
Thank you, Leon. I think it's just a combination. In investments, we're artists and scientists, so we have two sides to us. And so, a whole team of us are interested. In fact, no one external, all internal, just in the eye of the beholder.
And I suspected that was the case. Delphine, thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. On behalf of all of our viewers, we wish you all the best for Perpetua into the future. And thanks for the pearls of wisdom.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leon. Appreciate the opportunity.
That was Delphine Govender, founder and chief investment officer of Perpetua Investment Managers. And this is Leon Cralen of EBNet Stream.